Well, good morning to all of you.
Good morning, Dean.
The sheet, or the stapled sheet, has some additional pieces from last week. And so just so that we can get oriented, Yahweh is my shepherd. That starts a new section of items. And then there are two renditions of Psalm 23. And just to get your heart beating a little faster, we are going to sing one of them at the end. Hence, the piano and Mark. So there. And the other is the Hebrew alphabet. If you were to accompany me to seminary when I first took Hebrew, we were given a primer that is given to little Jewish girls and boys at the age of 5. And we had to start with the Hebrew alphabet. It was like going to nursery school as we repeated all of those letters. So I'm giving you that, and I'll tell you why later on. And then the quiz. There are 22 of them here. I'd like to see how many of you can remember them. Anyway, let's begin. Our prayer for this morning is taken from Psalm 19. And it starts this way. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out throughout the whole earth, and their words to the end of the world. No speech, no words, and yet something is communicated. And then the psalmist goes down and says, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. And he says, after going through 5 iterations of what that means to him, that it's like honey in the soul. And the conclusion of it is our prayer. That the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my salvation.
Amen.
So if you can see the progression in this psalm of communication without words, words that are enshrined and revered and embraced and tasted like honey. And then the psalmist says, may the words of my mouth be acceptable in thy sight. So that's how we're going to begin. Little interesting fun fact about that, Psalm 19, is Joseph Addison. He grew up in England, end of the 17th century on to the beginning of the 18th century. His father was a clergyman in the Church of England. Joseph did not follow in the family business. He became an essayist, a poet. He became a politician. There are 2 poems that he wrote that were turned into hymns. One of them is The Spacious Firmament on High. The music later on provided by Haydn. And the other one is Psalm 23, which I will read to you out of this Psalter. This Psalter was printed in 1824, and And it's got a quaint, very quaint title. It was printed in Cambridge, Mass. And this is what it says. A selection of hymns and psalms for social and private worship. Now, what are you going to do with those words? I have no idea. But my memory says, well, back then, there was private worship. It was in the home. There was social. It was the gathering. But this was the hymn book. The Psalms, the hymns, this is what people carried to church there. So it's out of this particular hymn book, Psalter, that Joseph Addison's Psalm 23 is found, along with other Congregational Baptist Lutheran hymns, all collected in here. Not just one genre, but many. Okay, for you that have come, Ryan, if I could ask you just to pass
You
these.
show up late, you're in trouble.
That's
huh?
it. That's
Yeah,
the way it worked
sorry.
when I went to college. Being that I majored in history when I went to college, I have this sense that history is important, and it provides a context for whatever we read, whatever we might want to write, whatever we want to learn. What's the context in which all of this takes place? Here's a brief context for our conversation about Psalm 23. In 1517, Martin Luther, this Augustinian priest, has the temerity to declare that it's by faith alone that one is justified before God. And what a ruckus that created in theological circles. And then it spilled out to the community. So Martin Luther, 1517, it's a date that we tag for the Reformation. But the ferment of the Reformation was going on way before that. But what happened dramatically is that the Psalms moved to the people. The choir of the prevailing church, the Roman church, sang the Psalms. And they sang it beautifully, and they sang it antiphonally. It was gorgeous music. But when the Reformation occurred, and Luther faced the congregation, then the Psalms also went into the congregation. And that then got carried to other communities of faith. They began to say, I think we can do that. We can recite those prayers. We can use tunes that we know, and we can make that happen. So there's a change that's beginning to take place. 1549, Book of Common Prayer comes into our life as Episcopalians. But it's interesting to note in 1534, that's when Henry VIII said, I'm in charge of the church, and the Pope is not, and that's the way it will be. So just a few years later, the Book of Common Prayer comes into our life. 1611, the King James Version comes. James says we want to have a Bible. It needs to be in the local language. It needs to be in the Anglo language, the English language. And so the Bible, known as the King James Version, emerges. And our quoting of the psalm very often is drawn from the King James Version. In 1612, there was a psalter that was produced. It was called the Ainsworth Psalter, and the Pilgrims used this one This is the one that they brought over. It was almost a direct translation from the words that were in the King James Version. There were a few emendations, but not much. In 1640, right in lovely downtown Boston, Richard Mather and other clergy, these were Puritan clergy, they decided we need to have a psalter. And so they put together a psalter, and they built upon the Ainsworth, but they were a little bit diseased by that psalter. It was too heavy. It didn't reflect what the Psalms were all about. So the Bay Psalter then became the Puritan Psalter. The Scots, not willing to be outdone, in 1650, they published the Psalter, the Scottish Psalter. It's a magnificent piece of literature for us all. It's got a reflection point, not an inflection point, a reflection point of what it means to be a Scot and to hear the words of the Psalms and how you take them to heart. So in 1650, another Psalter shows up. There was a dissenting pastor. A dissenting pastor was one who said, you know, I really don't agree with everything that's going on in England church-wise, but I'm not going to make a ruckus over it. I'm just going to dissent. As opposed to a group who said, that's it, I'm done, I'm separating. So there are two groups of people that begin to emerge in the UK, dissenters and separatists. And that helps us to understand some of the language that begins to emerge into the Psalms. If it's coming from a dissenting voice, what is that about? If it's coming from a separatist voice, what's that all about? So, Isaac Watts, his dad is a dissenting pastor. Young Isaac, growing up in the church, he almost got a scholarship to go to Oxford to become a priest. And he thought about that and he said, no, I don't think so. So he followed his dad's pathway of becoming a dissenting clergy. But Isaac had it in him that maybe his father was a little too dour. And so he complained. And he said to him, you know, the Psalms that we sing, drudgery, there's no joy in them. And so can you imagine this young 20-year-old having this conversation with his father, who's respected in the community as clergy? And so his dad says to him, Isaac, why don't you write some? 447 hymns later, Isaac has made a contribution. And he made a contribution in terms of the Psalms. He said, the Psalms need to be with language that imitates the New Testament. This is a bridge now that's being built. The language of the Psalms relating to the New Testament, relating to the fact that the Gospels are there. We need to know something about the Gospels, and the Psalms can help us to understand the Gospels. So that's in 1719. In 1797, Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, who's the president of Yale College, is commissioned by the Congregational Gathering in Connecticut to revise the Psalms in the style of Isaac Watts. He takes 2.5 years to do it. And in 1800, the Psalms come to the publisher. And it had a couple of iterations in publishing. And Isaac and Timothy Dwight now are collaborators in the Psalms. And there's a sense in which Isaac's desire for the psalmist's language to have an infusion of joy is there. This is his translation of Psalm 98. Isaac Watts' translation. Timothy Dwight's revision, which he really didn't revise very much. Psalm 98. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing. Sound familiar? This psalm was not designed for Christmas. It didn't make it into the Christmas hymnody for a long time. But this is what Isaac was about. And this is what Timothy Dwight saw. Now, you heard that. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let me just read to you what Psalm 98 is all about. It will come eventually. There we are. Psalm 98. O sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. The Lord has made known his victory. He has revealed his vindication in the light of nations. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Break forth into joyous songs and sing praises. Sing praises to the Lord with the lyre and the sound of melody, with trumpets and the sound of horn. Make a joyful noise before the King, the Lord. Maybe some of you have a question, which is, how did Isaac and Timothy Dwight come up with joy to the world, the Lord is come? By reading Psalm 98. We wish we had their crib notes. We wish we had some kind of autobiographical statement. The only thing we can piece together is this is the world that they were immersed in. This Psalter was a dominant piece of literature. It was the scripture in their hands. I wish I knew who was the person that dragged Isaac Watts' rendition of the 98th Psalm into Christmas carols. I think that person should be rewarded or something. Something great should happen to that person. In 1867, Henry Baker, a resident of the United States of America, an Episcopal priest, writes, "The King of love, my shepherd is." Hymn number 645 in our hymnal. And it's printed in the 2 scores that are on the sheet that I passed out. Henry Baker, taking a look at the Psalms, taking a look at the Psalter, and becoming more intimate with that psalm in his own personal life. These words flow. And that's the psalm that we're going to sing at the end. Henry Baker's psalm. And then this little fun fact. And with this, we'll conclude the historic review. In 1979, the Book of Common Prayer was revised. Here's the fun fact. This is the Book of Common Prayer that includes Psalm 23 in the burial rite from when the Book of Common Prayer was first written, back in 1549, even up through Cranmer in 1662, Psalm 23 does not make it to the burial rite. Lots of psalms were included in the burial rite, but not Psalm 23. It's in the revision of 1979 that psalm is to be read among a couple of others after the New Testament lesson. I just find that to be very fascinating. Historically, what happened there? People were reciting this, they were singing it. What happened there? I have no idea. I have no clue, other than the revision of the prayer book took 200 years. From 1789 to 1989. Who knows what went on there? So those are the fun facts. Now we're going to get after the psalm itself. So you can speak right now, because I'm going to ask a question. What do you know about David? First of all, who's his father?
Jesse.
Jesse. You know who his great-grandparents were?
Boaz and Ruth.
There you go, Boaz and Ruth. Do you know how many brothers he had?
11.
That's the total family. He had 7 brothers. He was the youngest. He had stepsisters, but he was the youngest, and he was born to Jesse's second wife. Do you know what Jesse and his boys did for work? Yeah. Shepherding was the family business. 3 of the boys enlisted in Saul's army. And it's those 3 boys that went to their brother, David, the young, and said, you know, this fellow Goliath, he's out there and he is not a nice person. And Saul wants to get rid of him. And so I can just imagine David, a young boy, saying, what's that to me? Why should I be involved in your stuff? You enlisted in the army. You know, you take care of it. So David is brought to the king, Saul. And his brothers really pump him up and say, you know, my brother he's really skillful with this slingshot. And I think he could take him down. And Saul said, I don't think so. He needs to have armor. And you know the story. He puts the armor on and David just about collapses. He can't do it. And you also know the fun little fact that is there. And David went down to the brook and he picked up 5 smooth stones, but he only used 1. Is that an embellishment? I mean, what are we talking about? The fact of the matter is, here it is. It's embedded in the scripture. This young boy, David, slingshot, 5 smooth stones, Goliath falls. And Saul is impressed. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about David and his family. Who is Uriah? Yeah, Bill.
A Hittite.
A Hittite.
Who was married to Bathsheba.
Oh, did you have to say that? Yes.
And he was a general.
And he was general. There we go.
And under David's command.
Yeah.
And poor guy got sent off to the front and the conspicuous place on the front.
Yes.
David thought, why don't you just die?
Yes. It's a gut-wrenching story. Monarch speaks to general. General says, yes, sir, and leaves. But what did the monarch have in mind? He had an image in his mind. He saw his wife, Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. And they have a tryst. And a little boy is born. That little boy dies before he's named. And Bathsheba has 2 other sons, one of them being Solomon. So here is tragedy that's beginning to show up in David's life. He's got a stepsister. A stepdaughter. Tamara. You know what happened to Tamara? She was raped by a family member. David's family. Who's Absalom? David's son. What do you know about David's son, Absalom?
Did he rise up against him at some point?
That's right. There was a civil war. And Joab, the general, says to the monarch, I think it's time that Absalom leave. He's done. I'll make sure that he's done. And Absalom dies. Absalom, oh Absalom, my son, is the plaintive lament of this father. Not the king, this father. David was an accomplished person. He was a diplomat, he was a general, he was a musician, he was a dad, he was a grandfather. He lived in pockets of distress as he reflected upon his life as a parent. He was one who cared. When Saul and Jonathan had died through suicide and warfare, David said to the disabled son Mephibosheth, come to my table and eat. That was unheard of. Saul is done with. You don't invite that person to your table. He's done with. And his family. The whole group. And David sensed something in this boy Mephibosheth and invites him to come to the table. So here's David. He's the author. He reflects the notion that life is precarious. And I think he also has this awareness that in the extremes of life, in the moments of precarious living, God is present. I was doing PhD studies at Boston University in sociology of religion. And one of my profs was Peter Berger, a sociologist. And he had written several books, a few of them I had read. And I wanted to take some courses by him. One of the books that he wrote was Rumor of Angels. And essentially, Peter Berger's take is, in the moments of extremis, there is a rumor of angels. when I read that again, I said, remarkable, absolutely remarkable. So here's a little tease for us all. In the moments of extremis in which maybe we have found ourselves, is it true? There's a rumor of angels? John Keats, poet, he says, life is a veil of soul making, not a veil of tears. Soul making. That four-letter word, soul, embedded in Psalm 23. And we'll see if we can unpack that in some way going forward. Okay, here's David the author. David the author, all of this that's part of his life. So essentially, what does he bring to this psalm is a legitimate question for us to ask, or even more broadly, what is this psalm anyway? Could it be that it's got a series of motifs there, and we can select one depending on where we are, spiritually, emotionally, socially? That might be the case. I mean, there's the motif of the guide and the host. And very often commentators just settle in on those two. Here's the psalm. You have the shepherd. He's leading. He's a guide. You go through the valley. And then you come out on the other side. And hospitality. The guide and the host. Some take a look at it and say, well, you know, this is really a psalm that portrays the life cycle from early life to middle life to older life. I think a case can be made for that too. Is this an autobiography of David? Is this the way he wanted to write his autobiography? Or maybe it sounds better if we call it David's memoir, as opposed to an autobiography. Or maybe it's just a biography in poetic form. Or is it just having the motif of moving from metaphor to that which is actual, personal, and real? Is that what's really going on there? Or is it a pattern? A chiastic pattern in the psalm. And I'm going to let that word just hang out there, sort of right about here. And you can look at it and see if you can figure it out. And then we'll come back to that. It's very clear from the Psalters and from experience in the Christian community and in the Hebrew community that the Psalms were to be recited, to be sung, and to be prayed. All three. And it gets mixed up, certainly. There doesn't seem to be, oh, well, these are all the ones that have praise in them. And then all of a sudden you get one of these laments that comes in and you say, wait a minute. Why can you not just do it, by the numbers and we'll be fine? Is life by the numbers? That's my take on Psalm, all 150 of them. It reflects that life is not as organized as we would like. That it takes various paths and it sort of wanders around. When I was a little boy, my dad had just come back from World War II, and we were living with my grandparents on the first floor of a double-decker, and my brother had just been born. He was about 2 years old when we moved in with my grandparents. And I can remember 3 toys that I had that I just thought were absolutely magnificent. One was a slinky. And my grandparents lived up on the 2nd floor, and I had to go up the back hall stairs. You get the picture? 5-year-old boy has slinky. Down the stairs it goes, and then he goes right up. Down the stairs he goes. I love that slinky. That was just terrific. I also had another one. A gyroscope. Oh, I was fascinated by that. You wind it up, and then you pull it, and then you hold it, or you put it down on the ground, and it just does its thing. How does that happen? A 5-year-old boy doesn't know about physics, but a 5-year-old boy knows this is mysterious. And the other? A prism. It's about this big. And my mom told me that if I put that when the sun comes in, it's going to do something to the light. She didn't tell me what it was going to do. She just said, that's what's going to happen. And so sure enough, I waited for the sun to come in the kitchen window. And I put it right up there. Color. How does that work? I was just intrigued. I played with those over and over again. What is the prism through which the Psalms are refracted in your life? Is a question that I think we ask ourselves often. We have these ways of understanding the Psalms. Okay, it's a memoir, it has these motifs, etc., etc. But I think ultimately it boils down to this. What is the prism through which the psalm is being refracted in your life? So, is it the prism of, I'm a biblical scholar, I know all of this, and that's my prism? Is it that I'm a literary critic and I can criticize the poetic form? That's my prism? Am I an anthropologist and I'm examining David's life, and I might even get into the psychosocial kind of thing? Is that how I'm refracting all of these words, these rays of light that are coming? Is the prism oriented to a childhood memory that I have? Is it oriented to a critical incident in my life? Is it just a piece of literature? Is that the prism? Just a piece of literature? Or am I the prism? Am I the prism? I think all of that pertains in some place. But what the Psalms are about is a level of intimacy between the human and God. And it doesn't back away from that. In extremis, it doesn't back away from that. In the joyful, rejoice, joy to the world, it doesn't back away from that. The story is told of Abraham Lincoln and Gilbert Green. Jonathan Goodman writes in his book, Heart, Lincoln at Heart. It's a simple story. Green and Lincoln knew one another. They lived in Springfield, Illinois together. Lincoln is the lawyer. Green is the publisher. They met often. They had conversations. This day, Lincoln goes over to Green and says, Gilbert, can you join me today? I have to ride out to see this woman. She wants to deliver her oral will to me. And the rule was an oral will had to be heard by 2 people. So Green says, yes. And they ride out. They come into this very humble house. 1 room. This elderly woman is dying, and she is aware of it. And so she greets Mr. Lincoln, and as he's beginning to say, what would you like in your will? She says to him, Mr. Lincoln, could you read from my Bible? What would you like me to read? Psalm 23, John 14. And could you just read a couple of hymns to me? And so Abraham Lincoln looked at her and said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they give me comfort. You prepare for me a table in the presence of mine enemies. Surely goodness and mercy shall be with me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And then he begins, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. I go to prepare a place for you so that where I am, there you can be also. There's a quietness in the room. Lincoln recalls a few hymns. He then takes down the dictation for the will, and they depart. On the road home, Gilbert Green says to his friend Abraham Lincoln, Abe, I'm so surprised today. You're a lawyer, but you also were a pastor. And Lincoln hesitated, then spoke. Mr. Green, today, God, eternity, and heaven were very close to me. And they rode back to Springfield with those words. Intimacy, personal movement into the heart, speaking from the heart, not from the head or the lips. I think John Goodman got it right. Lincoln at heart. So now, what are we going to do with this? Yahweh is my shepherd, he says. And if you turn in that which I printed, you'll see that as the heaven. Yahweh is my shepherd. Okay, let's unpack this word Yahweh a little. And there are 2 Hebrew scholars in the back, and I am terrified. I don't know why they keep on showing up. Jonathan and Joanna. Yahweh, the holy name of God. The holy name of God. Adonai is the name of God, but it's more acceptable because it's a step down from Yahweh. So the question is, where do people usually associate the word Yahweh? With whom and with what? Well, it's Moses. You recall, Moses got himself into trouble. He saw an Egyptian and an Israelite duking it out, and he decided enough is enough, and he goes and he does away with the Egyptian. Thinking that no one is around, of course there weren't any cameras or phones, but thinking no one was around, like God, he thought everything's fine. Until an Israelite comes and says, "Who do you think you are? Killing people." And the scripture says, and Moses fled. He went as far as he could go. He's invited into the house of Ruel. Ruel is a Midian priest, a priest living in Midian. He's got several daughters. One of them is Zipporah. Moses is invited to the table. And in the brevity of the Hebrew language, Moses and Zipporah get married. What, he goes to the table and then he eats and then he gets married? No, it's a long story, but that's what happens. But the other thing that happens is that Moses, a tender of sheep, he took care of his father-in-law's sheep for a long time, several decades. And he's walking, and you've heard Patrick preach on this, and there's the burning bush. And the bush is talking to him. And the bush doesn't burn down. And he begins to go towards it. He's intrigued. Moses, take off your sandals. This is holy ground. And then God speaks to Moses. I want you to go in to Pharaoh's house and essentially tell him, let my people go. And Moses, who am I going to say has said this? Yahweh. And what's the translation? I am that I am. That doesn't help, does it? An intransitive verb like that. That just doesn't help. There's no object there. It exists. I am that I am. Yahweh, the one who has no object in his vocabulary, the one who exists, who is present. Yahweh is my shepherd. David the shepherd boy. My shepherd is this one. This one who spoke to Moses. This one who comes from the train of Abraham and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob. They all tended sheep. This one who has some knowledge about what it means to be the shepherd. This one. He's my shepherd. What a confession. So I'm going to go back to this word, chiasm. That one that I hung out over here. Chiastic poetry has a theme that is crunched and delivered. It's the way it goes. It's how you frame it. So, what's the framing that goes on? There are 3 affirmations. I have no want. I. The second I comes, I have no fear. And the third I comes, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I don't have any wants. I haven't been caught up in the consumerism of life where all of the wants get morphed into needs that are propelled out for us to grab a hold of so that we can be satisfied. None of that. The psalmist says, and the psalters continually repeat it, I have nothing. I lack nothing because this is my shepherd. And I will not, while I'm in extremis, let fear take over. For you're the one who guides me. You're the one who leads me. You're the one who has the staff and the rod. And the conclusion, I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, moving on from there are these three statements that he makes in the third person. He, the shepherd, makes me to lie down. That sounds a little bit like parenting. Or, if you have a dog, lie down. I told you to lie down. I mean, we have those words that fly around in our head. That's not what's being said here. The shepherd provides for a way for me to settle down, to lie down, yes, to settle down. Because one of the things about sheep is that they're defenseless. And they're anxiety prone. They can be rattled by the slightest movements. So the psalmist says, my shepherd settles me down in the pasture so that I can digest my food. I'm eating, now it's time to digest. I can't digest if I'm anxiety prone or things are going around. No, just settle down and we'll be okay. He leads me beside the still waters, not the roaring waters. That's going to agitate the still waters. Ever been close to still waters? Quiet waters? And what does that do for us? He restores my soul. It's intriguing. Jane and I have been, we're really fixated on a couple of TV programs that come, on streaming. And one of them is Restore. And it's about this fellow out in California who restores houses. Wants to bring them back to their original form. So if you have a craftsman house, let's get rid of all of that stuff that is not craftsman and bring the house back. If it's a Victorian, let's get a palette of colors to make sure that the house looks like a Victorian. To restore the house is to bring it back to its original state. I think that's a mistake in the psalm. I think it needs to embrace the word that is used there. To breathe new life into me and my soul. Nefesh. It's used in the creation account. And God breathed into Adam. Or as James Weldon Johnson says in his magnificent set of poems about creation called God's Trombones, he went down and he picked up the mire and he formed it in his hands and then he breathed into it and it became alive. Only Weldon Johnson could say it in a sonorous tone that he has. restores my soul, breathes into me new life, and then leads me in paths of righteousness. The shepherd knows the paths. David, you were very kind to send a picture of paths in Israel. And I remember seeing some of those when we were there too. Narrow paths. Sometimes the paths are overrun with vegetation. But the shepherd knows which way. The sheep don't. But if the shepherd says it's good, hey, I'm good with that. I can follow. And so the shepherd knows. What is it that the shepherd knows about those narrow paths? Well, he knows where they're going to end up. He knows that if there is a storm and the water starts to run, he knows how to deal with that, rather than get caught up in a flash flood. The paths of righteousness. And what are the paths of righteousness? They are to establish a right relationship with people and a right relationship with God. Righteousness has to do with relationship. God, people, me. The Portuguese proverb that is there, God makes a crooked stick straight. How does God do that? Or as Luther says, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. Aha. But the straight path is connected to the integrity of the shepherd. That's crucial. And the straight path dealing with the right relationships that are there. Now we come to that second I statement, that second affirmation. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. A lot of conversation about what is this valley of the shadow of death. If you listen to Robert Murray McShane, a Scot, he talks about the dense, dark, gloomy moors on which I walk. If any of you have been to Scotland and the sun hasn't been out and you're in the moors, it's dark. It's dense. You might have difficulty finding your way. The valley of the shadow of death, the dense darkness, there is a story, and this is my own story. When I came to Vietnam, my first assignment, I thought, was going to be with a battalion of Marines, but it wasn't. My division chaplain said, I want you to go down to the field hospital down in Chu Lai, and we have to put you in there for about 6 weeks until the replacement comes, because the chaplain who was there had to go home. Okay, I'm young. I know how to salute. He's got 4 stripes on his sleeve. I can do that. And so here it is. I'm in this place that is a configuration of a hospital with an accent of MASH in it. If any of you recall that particular television program. And so my routine was to visit all the Marines that were in the hospital. And I was doing that, and that was okay. But the thing that was happening as well is that this was a receiving place when a medevac helicopter would come in and there would be casualties. And the expectation was for myself and the priest to be there at that time. And we were. And so we came, and we did. And this happened often. This one night, it was very quiet. I didn't think anything was going to go on. I made my routine, my rounds, and it was coming close to midnight, and I usually saw the incoming watch and said goodbye to the outgoing watch. And so I said to the third class petty officer, seems sort of quiet tonight. What do you think? He says, yeah, it's really been quiet. You know, Chaplain, if anything happens, we'll give you a call. And so I said good night, and I went back to my bunk. And about 12:30, I get a call. We have a medevac helicopter coming in. It'll be in 5 minutes. I said, I'll be up. So I came up. Sure enough, there were these Marines. They had been ambushed. There were 2 that were serious. There were 3 that weren't so serious. And the triage rule is, let's take a look and see who needs help right now. And the others, well, the 3, they didn't need as much as the 2. And the 2, they needed some help. And so I went over to this young fellow, 18-year-old. I introduced myself. I said, I'm Chaplain Pedersen. Your name tag says your last name is Roberts. Yes, sir. Where are you from? He says, Detroit. I said, and when did you come in country? And he told me. And I said, I'd like to pray with you. And he said, that'd be fine. Oh, by the way, Chaplain, would you pray for my mom too? I said, sure. What's her name? Gave me the name. And I held his hand. And 30 seconds into that tight grip became limp. And he died. I got up. I said to the doctor, I think he died. And I went over to the other Marine. I said the same thing. His wound was not as severe, come to find out. About 1:30, I went back to my bunk. It's dark. South China Sea is just out there. Familiar sight. I stood in my room. And I began to sob. What was it? Death? Certainly. My death? No, not my death. What was it? For about 15 minutes in that room. And this is what I heard. Even though you go through the valley of the shadow of death, you will fear no evil. Why is that important? Because coming into Vietnam, fear dominated. I didn't know whether I'd go home in a green bag or not. I had a wife and a child. What was I thinking signing up to become a chaplain? What was going on? And all of that reverberates. And in the still waters of the tears, the shepherd breathed new life into me. So that from that day forward, there was no hesitation about where I would go or why. I just knew that the shepherd was going to guide me. The last affirmation is about hospitality. He sets a table before me in the presence of my distressors in the presence of my enemies, in the presence of the antagonisms, and all of that that accumulates into my life, the shepherd. And the interesting thing about that is that the shepherd, God, is functioning as a host, but it's with a female voice. You see, men don't cook. And when it says that, and he prepared a table before me in the presence, it's the feast. It's the whole feast. And here is the whisper that shows up. It's Christ, the good shepherd, with the lost sheep, the prodigal son. All of that is what Isaac Watts wanted. Mm-hmm. So Mark, we're not going to sing the whole thing, obviously, but I just want to give you a sense. Yeah. And this is the Irish melody that's before us. It says, "The King of love, my shepherd is, whose goodness faileth never. I nothing lack. If I am his, and he is mine forever." We are streams Sing the sixth stanza. And so through all the length of days, my goodness faileth never. Good shepherd, may I sing thy praise within thy house forever. Shalom Aleichem. Peace to all of you on this day. And by the way, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. If you want to break up Psalm 119 into 22 sections, which it is, you can put a letter at each section of either 8 or 9 verses until you get through the 175. And the quiz will be sometime at a cup of coffee. I'll ask you to write the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Peace to all of you.